Hi, my name is Sheridan Forster. Um, this is a presentation that I did at uh, the ASID conference 2015. So it's currently February 2025. So this is 10 years ago. I wanted to do this recording of me speaking through that presentation because I think it's a presentation that's worthwhile sharing to generate discussions. So I'm going to go straight into it and try and keep it brief enough for people to watch easily. Um, so the presentation was called Stop Asking, Hands Down, Shoosh, Social Restraint in the Name of Appropriateness. This is the full abstract. I will make a link to, I guess, the slides from the presentation. I won't go through that because hopefully that's what I cover when I'm talking. Okay, so the context is I was thinking about people, services for adults with who have severe or profound levels of intellectual disability. I had used a Facebook group that I was involved in at the time. I don't think it's still going, but it was called Severe Profound Intellectual Disability Australia. It was very much about thinking about the practice, what I was seeing happening for people with severe and profound intellectual disability, the research at the time, and thinking about how that all goes back to practice. It was all born out of curiosity, and I see the presentation not being about answers, but about questions and discussions that we can have. So, introducing the issue. The issue that I was thinking about at the time is these things that I heard and saw going on. People being told to shush, people being told hands down or hands out, and people being told to stop asking. I'll go a bit more into those issues. So I invited people from that Facebook group to give me their thoughts on some of these things that I was seeing, and I'll read through the accounts. So a parent had said, "My D uses touch when he is communicating with people. Last week, this was referred to as assaultive behaviour by a certain person. The connotations of this are alarming, but the poor thing being nagged not to touch people for the rest of his life, his method of communication being undermined, as well as being monitored via behaviour reports for all eternity. Could this even lead to being drugged so as to comply with another's expectations of normal communication?" Another family member said, "My son uses touch too, and it was suggested years ago that his perception of spatial awareness is not so good. So, in order for him to connect and know where he is, he often touches. Many workers have no problem, but some have been seen to back off, raise their hands, like a traffic cop saying loudly, 'Space.'" Another family member said, "I remember when Dee was at school and he was constantly being told to straighten his arms or put his arms in his pockets. They were trying to make him look normal, I think. It went on for years until I discovered he had dislocated radial joints in both elbows, which is actually painful when his arms are straight. I had to tell the teacher to back off. All that nagging really stressed him out as well. He was much happier after he left school and people left him the hell alone." Another account. "My D reaches out to grab people, which is his way of compensation for his poor speech and his way of gaining their attention. I too have been told it is assault. He spends his life being told about personal space and hands to yourself, but it is his attempt to communicate. However, he doesn't do it at home because he knows he doesn't need to, because he already has our attention. It is constantly what I constantly say. They are only valuable if they can be as much like the rest of us as possible. Tuck them away in ones and twos where their visibility is minimized and hope they don't draw attention to themselves. Call it inclusion. So much for promoting diversity." So thinking about what is this thing that I'm talking about, what the conversation that I started, is it, you know, people trying to teach a person appropriate behavior? Is it people trying to help people with severe disabilities fit in? Or is it otherwise named as admonishment, as reprimanding, as a form of social restraint? Is it verbal abuse towards people? Is it harassment? Why does this sort of thing happen? I took the lead from Vicky Russell and some of the work with NoFASD and Diane Melbourne from Facets. This is organisations and thinking about people with FASD, but I think it has enormous value and relevance here. So they set up this, Diane set up this table and looked at the values and values clashes. And she talked about the primary characteristic of a person, then the values and expectations that society or disability supports or families or whatever might put on that person commonly in regards to that characteristic. The interpretation that people might have about why a person's doing a particular characteristic, the sort of education or intervention or well-meaning practices, but then the subsequent secondary symptom that can come from being intervened in or interpreted in that way. And the alternative accommodation of building on the person's strengths and understanding the cause of the primary characteristic. So you might have primary characteristics of a person's disability, and the way that they're interpreted, understood, has a secondary outcome. So in this, the first example, dysmaturity. So if somebody's behaving in a way that is not up to their age, you know, there might be an expectation that, well, people have got to act their age, and people might be interpreted as being a baby or being lazy or not trying. The intervention might be to punish. It might be to say, stop being a baby, you know, stop being lazy, you've got to try. The unintended secondary symptom can be anger and anxiety. But the alternative is to think, okay, this person's got immature behavior. How can we accommodate that? How can we understand where they're coming from? The second example, so confabulation, and confabulation is a word that's used for when people say things that are not true, but they're not saying it as a manipulative lie. They're saying it because their brain is putting together the various ideas that they've got, and they come out with something. Our belief is, you know, people should be honest. The interpretation is that the person's lying or being manipulative or at me or in fear. And the intervention might be to punish the person or ground the person or say, oh, you've got to be honest. You can't say that. That's not true. Then if a person is being punished for the way their brain puts together a story, you get that anger. The accommodation is if you understand the brain dysfunction, the way that confabulation occurs, if you alter your communication with that person. So these are a couple of examples, and I so taken from the area of working with people with FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. I then thought about these in the situations I'm talking about here. So if a person makes a vocalization, non-speech, our values and expectations might be, you know, people are supposed to be quiet and at a certain volume in public and in their homes. The interpretation might be that the person's noisy or whining or frustrated or tired. The intervention that I've seen happen is saying to people, quiet, shush, you need to, or, you know, maybe giving the person their own space. The secondary symptom can often be if a person's yelled at for making loud noises, quite often the secondary symptom can be that they make louder noises and relationships aren't terribly great. But maybe if we look at that from an accommodation, what do we do? If a person's asking questions repetitively, and our values say that people are only allowed to ask something once, and if they already know the answer, they're not allowed to ask it at all. The interpretation could be that the person is being annoying or attention seeking. The intervention could be teach the person to say it once, an educational intervention. Often that sort of response often leads to the person being more anxious and asking more. Similarly, if they're reaching out to touch people, but the values are we don't touch people and it's seen as inappropriate. So thinking from that perspective, what about a different perspective though? So let's think about the idea of shoosh. If somebody's making loud vocalizations, that's what they do. Can we see that the person's sounds are just as valid as speech sounds? Can we see that they're expressing something that needs to be responded to? Can we see that the person needs to know when it is and isn't appropriate to make loud sounds? I don't know. Maybe they can't learn that. Maybe they can. Maybe the person needs to be reminded to quieten, or the person is upsetting everybody else. So this is not me saying what we should do. This is saying, okay, what are some of the different perspectives that we can look at the person who is making the loud sounds? Similarly, the hands down, there's some of the different perspectives there. Maybe the perspective could be the person needs to be taught about appropriate space and the risk of abuse if there's using touch. Maybe the person can be taught that I don't want to be touched and I need my personal space. Maybe the person can be taught about professional context, or maybe we can see it as a legitimate form of communication to use touch. So I particularly think of a lot of people with Down syndrome who have spent their life being told off for going in for the hug. And how that's experienced when they're a child, when they're a young adult, when they're an older adult. Maybe there's times when touch comes back into vogue because it's the best form of communication you've got left. The stop asking. So the person, the perspective could be the person needs to learn to stop asking. It's annoying. The person could be provided with external prompting to help the person. So thinking, maybe just a raise of the fingers to sort of say, maybe we could just realize that it's actually echolalia and it's a legitimate form of communication, which can be indicating an underlying stress in the moment that needs to be addressed. And here, some people have a behavioral phenotype with constant questioning that is related to specific situations. And I've put a point about Chris Oliver's work there. If your brain is different such that you are impulsive, that is what your brain is doing. You can't necessarily change that impulsivity, and you need to understand the behavior in the context of a different brain. So I thought about what have researchers said about this idea of shush, hands down, stop asking, and the scattered comments. Nobody's responded specifically to this question. So I really like the work of Antaki and Rapley and Finlay, Chris Finlay. They have a great paper called The Dilemma for Staff Playing a Game with a Person with Profound Intellectual Disability, Empowerment, Inclusion, Competence and Interactional Practice. And in that paper, they have a look at a person sitting on the floor playing a game and they turn away. And the support worker, what do we judge if the support worker tries to re-engage them? Or what do we judge if the support worker doesn't try to re-engage them? Are they empowering them by listening to the person's refusal, or are they disempowering by not trying to re-engage? And that's why they're calling it a dilemma. Is these responses, it's hard to know what the right thing to do is. I need to go back because I haven't had a look at this paper by Celia Todd, Evaluative Language Directed to Adults with Disabilities, Positive and Negative. What else did I find? Hands down. Okay, what else? As far as I'm concerned, problems arise when people with intellectual disabilities are subjected to ceaseless pressure to conform to socially normative behaviours and practices. Oh, okay. So this is Yanni Klotz's great PhD work. where she observed her sister and the interactions that were had with her sister. And she saw the ceaseless pressure to conform, the ceaseless nagging, the ceaseless telling her what she could and couldn't do. So 2005 qualitative study. And I want to read this because I think, yeah, it's really important. You can also look up Yanni Klotz's interview that she did for Mind Matters, ABC, I think. Okay, she says, yet the staff where my sister lives are under instructions to constantly institute new programs that attempt to transform who she is. This is part of their responsibility under the New South Wales Disability Services Act, and it involves fostering community interaction as well as encouraging normative behaviour. For example, Mariella always likes to know exactly what's happening around her, who is doing what and going where, and especially what is happening to her. She also maintains a running commentary on what's going on around her. As part of her ongoing commentaries, Mariella requires the person who is speaking with to both affirm her observations and supply the final word of her statement. These interactions go something like this. Oh, Johnny, she calls me. Oh, Johnny, Mummy just going to put the plates on the table. She's just going to put the plates on the table. Mummy not going to put the plates in the. Mariella then waits for the person with whom she is talking to provide the missing word, in this case, sink. But the interaction doesn't stop there. Mariella will go through and repeat the exact phrasing 2 or 3 more times, each time wanting the person to provide the last word, before she finally accepts that is what is happening. She will then finish off the word sink by herself. It's not that Mariella doesn't know that the conclusion to the phrase. On the contrary, she is absolutely certain about the word she is expecting to hear and will get very upset if it is not provided. This mode of interaction can be quite time consuming, but it is her way of communicating and participating in the social world. And we as a family have learnt to accommodate it. However, due to their obligations and the consequence of the structural constraints of institutionalised care, the staff at the centre where Mariella has lived since she was a teenager have a management plan in place which discourages her from interacting in this way. She's told that she only needs to say the comment or ask the question once, and that she can't expect staff to have ongoing interactions with her in this manner. When my husband and I went to take her out to a picnic one day, I observed the destructive consequences of this approach. The sad irony was that what could have taken a few minutes in the staff person's time ended up taking as long as it would if Mariella had been allowed to communicate in her own way. Both Mariella and the staff person ended up angry, frustrated, and upset. So coming back to the issue, when is the intervention or the education unjustified? When do you know the intervention doesn't work? And can you deliver the intervention in a more respectful way? Putting some of those questions out. What's been written in policy? And this is 10 years ago, and I was looking at the Department of Health and Human Services Victoria policy then, and disability, oh no, policy. And they discussed discusses respect, rights, and difference. So the 2006 Act, where they were talking about when restrictive practices were first started getting documented, they talked about psychosocial restraint, but it wasn't a reportable thing then. The guide said usually includes the use of power control strategies, such as being told to stay in one area of the house until they can leave, being directed to stay in an unlocked room, corner, or area, or stay in a specific space until they, I actually repeated that, being directed to remain in a particular position until told to discontinue, overcorrection responses, withdrawal of social interaction for periods of time without a reasonable rationale, and withdrawal of so-called privileges. So they talked about psychosocial restraint, these power control strategies, but they weren't being reported at that time. And I don't think they're still reported. The Australian Psychological Society also talked about psychosocial restraint. So the use of social or material sanctions, verbal threats of those sanctions to attempt to moderate a person's behaviour, includes practices such as response cost or restrictive access. I won't go into those, but yeah, psychosocial restraint has been written about, but have we actually responded to or changed or been aware of when something is actually a power restraint on the person with disability for their different, because of their different communication? We look at the CRPD, I've just forgotten it, rights of person with a disability, and the articles that can relate to that: the respect of difference and acceptance of human diversity, the freedom from cruel, degrading treatment or punishment, the freedom from violence and abuse, the protection of the integrity of that person, the freedom of expression and opinion and access to information, and the right to education so that they can participate. So, what could happen next? We have this issue where social restraint, badgering, um, things that are supposed to be educational, but if the person is getting that same response for years on end, it's pretty hard not to say that it's not badgering or bordering on harassment, even though people have done it because they think this is, what society values and this is what we must do to have people with disabilities valued. Um, we thinking that, yeah. So what we need to do? Well, the everyday talk needs to be talked about. We need to be aware. It sort of blows me away that so many businesses record their phone calls, and yet we're sort of reluctant in the disability field to record the everyday interactions and deeply reflect on how does the way that somebody's talking to you affect your life, affect the life of the person with disability? How does being communicated with in a way that's not meaningful to you will increase isolation? So we need to talk about everyday talk. We need to think about the impact of everyday talk. We need to respond in a way that is not perpetuating undue power over the person through using power speech. We need to have conversations that recognize where each person is and their values and their learnings and their abilities and their difference and their diversity. That normal is not the benchmark. Typical is not the benchmark. We need to look at different ways of looking at quality. If we have a look at what happens in typical interaction, be it the words that people are saying to each other or the body language that people are giving towards each other, or the amounts of times that somebody actually sits down with a person, or the rates of no responses where the person's told off for something compared to the rates of positive responses to that person. We need to look more closely at what is happening in everyday interaction and consider what that means to the person. So that is the presentation that I did about 10 years ago. I still think there's incredible relevance in it. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Encourage you to talk about it. Think about when you've seen social restraint or judgment or power over people with disabilities that possibly doesn't understand the nature of what they're doing.